The wind was a constant thief on the prairie, stealing the warmth from a boy's skin and the hope from a man's heart. It scoured the land, leaving nothing but dust, tough grass, and the skeletal remains of ambitions that had withered on the vine. For 14-year-old Elam Thatcher, the wind was the voice of the emptiness that surrounded their sod house, a low, ceaseless moan that promised only more of the same. Today, it carried a different sound, a texture of wrongness that snagged in his ear. It was a faint, rhythmic scraping, almost lost beneath the keening of the wind against the barn's plank walls. He had been sent to check the latch on the grain store, a simple chore that had become his ritual escape from the tense silence within the house, a silence thicker than the mud and grass walls that contained it. His father's face, etched with the furrows of a failed crop and the fear of a coming winter, was a landscape Elam had learned to navigate with caution. A misplaced word, a tool left in the dew, could bring a storm of quiet, potent disapproval. He pulled his thin coat tighter, the worn wool doing little to fend off the chill that had less to do with the air and more to do with the gnawing anxiety that was the daily bread of this place. The scraping sound came again, closer this time. It was the sound of something dragging, not an animal. It was too deliberate. He rounded the corner of the barn, his boots sinking into the soft earth that never seemed to dry, and stopped. The world narrowed to a single, stark image. A person, a woman, crumpled near the water trough, one hand outstretched as if she had been crawling for it. Her clothes were a wreck of hide and torn fabric, her dark hair matted with dirt and something blacker, stickier. He saw the stain first, a dark bloom spreading across the small of her back and down her leg. She was an Indian. The word struck him with the force of a physical blow, a catechism of his father's warnings. They're not like us. They are a different kind of being, born of the wild, and they will take what you have without a thought. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through him. He should run. He should go to the house, to his father, to the rifle that rested above the hearth. That was the sensible thing, the safe thing. But he remained frozen, his gaze fixed on the stillness of her form. The wind whipped a strand of her hair across her face, and for a moment he saw the sharp line of her cheekbone, the curve of her mouth. She was not a being. She was a woman. The stakes of this moment laid themselves bare in the stark afternoon light. To help her was to invite a world of danger he could barely comprehend, to defy the one law his father held absolute. To leave her was to become accomplice to the slow, thirsty death the prairie was offering. He could feel the despair of it all, the immense, crushing weight of the sky and the land and this impossible choice. The scent of dust was thick in his throat, mixed now with a faint, coppery smell of blood that the wind could not entirely disperse. Her fingers twitched, a barely perceptible movement against the dark, damp earth. She was alive. The knowledge did not bring relief, only a heavier burden of responsibility. He took a hesitant step forward, the sound of his own breathing loud and foreign in the vast, uncaring silence. His first instinct was to retreat into the familiar territory of obedience, to the safety of the sod house and the illusion of order it provided. The image of his father's face, grim and unyielding, rose in his mind. Leave be what ain't your business, Elam. This land don't reward meddlers. But the sight of her, so utterly broken against the hard edge of their world, held him fast. He could not reconcile the creature from his father's warnings with the human being bleeding into the dirt a few yards away. He moved slowly, deliberately, his steps measured as if treading on thin ice. He made his approach wide, circling so she might see him coming, so as not to appear a predator. He was only a boy, thin and wiry, his hands calloused from chores but not yet broadened by a man's labor. Perhaps that smallness would be his shield. As he drew nearer, her head lifted a slow, painful motion. Her eyes found his. They were dark, fathomless, and filled not with the savagery he had been taught to expect, but with a weary, cornered pain. There was fear there, yes, but it was the fear of an animal that has been tracked to exhaustion, one that knows the final blow is coming. She did not cry out. She did not move, save for the tightening of the muscles in her jaw. She simply watched him, her breath a shallow rasp. Elam stopped a few feet away, his own breath caught in his chest. Words failed him. What could he say? The language of this land was silence and survival, and he was fluent in neither. He could only act. He thought of the old horse blanket in the barn, the one his mother had declared too threadbare for even a mule. It was coarse and smelled of hay and thyme, but it was something. He backed away slowly, never breaking eye contact, and slipped into the dim, familiar interior of the barn. The air inside was thick with the scent of dried alfalfa and leather. He grabbed the blanket from its peg, its rough texture a comfort against his trembling hands. When he emerged, she had not moved. Her eyes were still fixed on the space where he had been. He approached again, just as slowly, and held the blanket out. An offering, a truce. Her gaze dropped to the folded wool, then lifted back to his face. She was reading him, he knew, searching for the intent behind the gesture. He saw a flicker of profound suspicion, a lifetime of experience that told her a white hand offered nothing without a price. He knelt, the damp earth seeping through the knee of his trousers, and gently laid the blanket beside her, careful not to touch her. Then he retreated to the water pump. The handle shrieked in protest as he worked it, the sound unnervingly loud. He filled a tin cup, the water sloshing over the rim, cold and clear. He placed it on the ground near the blanket, a second offering. He had done all he could, all he dared. He backed away again, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, and slipped around the corner of the barn, out of her line of sight. He pressed himself against the rough planks, listening. For a long time there was only the wind. Then a faint rustle of cloth, the soft clink of tin against the ground. He risked a glance. She had pulled the blanket around her shoulders, a dark shroud of meager warmth. The cup was empty. The secret was now sealed between them, a fragile, unspoken pact made in the shadow of the barn. He turned toward the house, the lie he would have to tell already forming on his lips, the weight of it as real and as heavy as a stone in his pocket. The days that followed fell into a new, clandestine rhythm, a life lived in the margins of his real one. His waking hours were cleaved in two, the boy who did his chores under his father's watchful eye, and the boy who pilfered from their meager stores to keep a stranger alive. Each morning, he would slip a portion of his own breakfast into a small cloth, a heel of cornbread, a strip of salted pork if he was lucky. He would hide it in the barn, and later, when his duties took him to the far side of the property, he would retrieve it and make his silent delivery. She was always there, in the sheltered lee of the north wall, a space hidden from the house by the bulk of the hayrick. She never spoke. She would only watch him approach, her eyes following his every movement. The initial fear in her gaze had been replaced by something less definable, a deep and unreadable caution. She would accept the food with a slow, deliberate nod of her head, her movements still stiff with pain. He saw that she was tending to her wound herself, using some kind of poultice made from chewed leaves and mud. It looked crude, but the angry redness around the gash on her leg seemed to be receding. One afternoon, when the air was still and heavy with the promise of rain, he brought her a bucket of fresh water from the well and a clean rag he'd taken from his mother's mending basket. He set them down and gestured toward her leg. It was a risk, a crossing of a boundary they had both implicitly respected. She stared at him, her expression hardening. For a moment, he thought she would refuse, that he had pushed too far. He saw the pride in her, a fierce, unyielding thing that had survived whatever had brought her here. But then her shoulders slumped, a concession not to him, but to the pain that was her constant companion. She shifted, exposing the wound. It was a long, ugly tear in the flesh, deep and weeping. His stomach turned, but he forced himself to kneel. His hands shook as he dipped the rag into the cool water. He hesitated, his knuckles hovering just above her skin. Her gaze was a physical weight upon him. He could feel her assessing his touch before it even landed. He began to clean the wound, his motions gentle, clumsy. He was a boy who knew how to mend a fence and splint a calf's leg, but this was different. This was human skin, human pain. He worked in silence, acutely aware of her stillness, her shallow breathing. He felt a profound intimacy in the act, a connection that transcended language. He was no longer just providing sustenance. He was providing care. In her silent acceptance, he felt a fragile thread of trust being spun between them. When he finished, he looked up and met her eyes. He saw something there that hadn't been before. Gratitude, perhaps, but it was more complex than that. It was a flicker of acknowledgement, a recognition that he was not his father, not the man who had likely put the fear in her eyes. He was just Elam. And for now, in this small, hidden world, that was enough. The prairie outside was vast and unforgiving, a place of stark lines and harsh judgments. But here, in the shadow of the barn, a different kind of territory was being mapped, one of quiet gestures and shared vulnerability. It was nearly a week after he found her that she spoke. The sun was low, casting long, distorted shadows that made the prairie look like a rumpled blanket. Elam had brought her a bowl of thin stew, stolen from the pot while his mother was outside. He set it down, and as he turned to leave, her voice stopped him. It was low and raspy, cracked from disuse, the single word shaped by a tongue unaccustomed to his language. Why? He turned back, surprised. He had grown so used to their silence that the sound of her voice was a shock, like a stone dropped into a still pond. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw that the pain had receded from her eyes, leaving a clear, intelligent light. She was younger than he had first thought, her face less weathered by age and more by hardship. He didn't know how to answer her question. Why had he helped her? Because his mother had taught him kindness? Because his father's harshness had bred a contrary streak in him? Because leaving her to die felt like a sin the vast, empty sky would never forgive? He settled on the simplest truth. You were hurt, he said, his own voice sounding boyish and uncertain. She considered his answer, her dark eyes searching his face. Others would not, she stated. It was not a question. It was a fact, a truth she had learned and carried in her bones. I am not others, he replied, the words bolder than he felt. A small, humorless smile touched her lips for an instant. No, she agreed. She ate the stew slowly, deliberately, as if savoring a memory of flavor. When she was finished, she looked at him again. My name is Tabani. The name felt solid real. It replaced the label of Indian woman stranger and gave her a place in the world, at least in his small corner of it. It was a gift, a piece of herself offered in return for the bread and the water and the clean rag. I'm Elam, he said. Elam, she repeated, the name sounding different in her mouth, the vowels softer. Over the next few days, a sparse and halting dialogue began to form between them. Her English was broken, learned in pieces from traders or missionaries, he guessed, but her meaning was clear. He learned that she was Comanche, that she had been traveling with her family when they were ambushed, not by soldiers but by white men, buffalo hunters, she thought, men who killed for sport and profit, who saw no distinction between the beast and the people who lived alongside it. She did not dwell on the violence. She spoke of it in clipped, factual sentences, her emotions locked away behind a stoic mask. But Elam could see it in the brief clenching of her jaw, the way her gaze would go distant, seeing a scene he could only imagine in his worst nightmares. He learned that she had run, wounded, for 2 days before collapsing by his family's barn. Her story unspooled in fragments, leaving more unsaid than said, but the spaces in between were filled with a resilience that awed him. She was not defined by her victimhood, but by her survival. She was Tabani, a daughter, a sister, a survivor. Each new piece of information chipped away at the foundation of his father's worldview. The world was not a simple place of good and evil, settler and savage. It was a tangled, messy, and heartbreaking place, and Tabani was proof of it. Tabani's strength returned with the patient stubbornness of the prairie grass pushing through hard-packed earth. Soon, she was no longer confined to the ground. She could stand, her movements still careful but gaining fluidity each day. She would pace the narrow confines of her hiding spot, a caged energy radiating from her. From the sliver of space between the hayrick and the barn wall, she had a vantage point, a small window into the rhythm of the Thatcher homestead. Elam would watch her watching them. He saw his own life reflected in her observant gaze. She saw his father, Jedediah, a man bent by labor, his silence a shield against a world that had offered him little but toil. She saw his mother, Sarah, her hands never still, her face a constant map of worry for her children and her husband. And she saw Elam's younger sister, Mary, a bright spark of childish innocence in the grim landscape. Tabani saw the harshness of their existence, the precariousness of their survival, and in her eyes, Elam saw not judgment, but a flicker of recognition. Their struggles were different in form, but not in substance. The land was an adversary to them all. A quiet understanding began to flow between them, a language of shared experience that needed no words. One afternoon, as Elam was mending a broken harness, fumbling with the stiff leather, Tabani spoke from the shadows. Not like that, he looked up, startled. She gestured with her chin. The stitch is weak. It will break again. She emerged cautiously from her hiding place, glancing toward the house, and knelt beside him. She took the awl and the leather strip from his hands. Her fingers, long and nimble, moved with a practiced economy he had never witnessed. She did not use his wide, clumsy stitches. Instead, she wove the leather through itself in a tight, intricate pattern that was both strong and elegant. She was showing him, not just telling him. It was a lesson, a gift of knowledge passed from her world to his. He watched, mesmerized, as she finished the repair. The seam was stronger than the original. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, his voice full of a new respect. A shadow passed over her face. "My father," she said softly, and he knew not to ask more. In the days that followed, she offered other small pieces of her world. She showed him how to read the subtle signs in the dirt, the track of a coyote, the scrape of a hawk's wing on its landing. She pointed out an herb growing by the creek that his mother dismissed as a weed, explaining how its leaves could be crushed to soothe a burn. Elam's world, once defined by the straight lines of plowed furrows and the square walls of his home, began to expand. It gained texture, depth, and a history that stretched back long before his family's claim stake had pierced the soil. He started to see the prairie not as an empty space to be conquered, but as a living place full of stories and secrets, if one only knew how to look. This knowledge felt dangerous, illicit. It was a direct contradiction to everything his father stood for. Jedediah Thatcher saw the land as something to be broken, tamed, and forced into submission. Tabani saw it as something to be understood, respected, and lived with. The line his father had drawn between their people began to blur, its edges bleeding into a new and uncertain territory in Elam's mind. The fragile piece of their secret world could not hold. It was as precarious as a spider's web in a gale, and the wind was rising. Jedediah Thatcher was not a foolish man. He was a man of patterns and routines, and he noticed when they were disrupted. He noticed the slight dip in the level of the cornmeal sack, the missing sliver of jerky, the way his son's eyes would drift toward the barn when he thought no one was looking. Elam's distraction became a source of friction, a grit in the machinery of their family life. The questions started casually. "You seem to be spending a powerful lot of time in that barn, son." Elam would mumble an excuse about a loose board or a nesting rat. But the excuses wore thin, and his father's gaze grew sharper, more suspicious. The tension in the sod house thickened until it was a palpable presence at the dinner table. One evening, after a day of Elam being particularly distant, his father cornered him by the hearth. The firelight cast flickering, monstrous shadows on the walls. "I will ask you once, Elam, and you will give me a straight answer," Jedediah said, his voice low and devoid of warmth. "What is it you are hiding?" Elam's heart hammered against his ribs. The lie felt flimsy and transparent on his tongue. "Nothing, Pa." I swear at Jedediah's eyes, the color of a stormy sky, narrowed. He did not believe him. "There are things out on that prairie that will chew you up and spit you out. Dangers you don't even have a name for. We came here to build a life, not to throw it away on foolishness. You remember what I told you about the Comanche? They are not our kind. They are a pestilence on this land, and you do not show kindness to a pestilence. The word, ugly and sharp, hung in the air between them. It was a brand, a condemnation, and it made Elam's stomach clench with a mixture of anger and fear. He knew Tabani. He knew the quiet dignity in her eyes, the strength in her hands, the sorrow she carried. She was not a pestilence. She was a person. At that same time, a new and more immediate threat began to manifest. Twice, Elam saw a lone rider on the distant ridge to the west, a stark silhouette against the setting sun. The figure was too far to make out details, but it was not one of their neighbors. The posture was different. The way the rider sat the horse was foreign. A knot of dread tightened in his gut. He said nothing to his father, knowing it would only confirm his suspicions and bring his wrath down on Tabani. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that they were looking for her. Tabani felt it too. The change in her was subtle but unmistakable. She grew quiet again, the sparse words they had shared drying up. Her body was a study in tense vigilance. She spent less time in the open, retreating to the deepest shadows of her hiding place. Her gaze was constantly fixed on the horizon, her head cocked, as if listening for a sound only she could hear. The secret that had once been a fragile bond between them now felt like a lit fuse, sputtering its way toward an inevitable explosion. The explosion came on a day when the sky was a sheet of flat, indifferent gray. They did not ride in with whoops or hollers, not with the wild aggression of Elam's darkest imaginings. They came with a grim and silent purpose. 3 riders, materializing out of the vast emptiness of the west, as if the land itself had birthed them. They were painted, streaks of black and ochre stark against their skin. They carried rifles across their saddles and bows slung over their backs. They were Comanche. They halted 100 yards from the homestead, a distance that was both a courtesy and a threat. They sat their horses, still as statues, their presence a profound violation of the fragile peace of the Thatcher claim. The world seemed to hold its breath. From inside the house, Elam heard his father's sharp intake of breath, followed by the familiar, ominous scrape of the rifle being lifted from its hooks above the hearth. "Sarah, get the children to the back." Jedediah's voice was tight, strained. "Elam, get in the house. Now." But Elam was frozen. He was caught in the open, halfway between the perceived safety of the sod house and the known reality of the barn. His heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of his ribs. He could feel the rider's eyes on him, dark and assessing. He risked a glance toward the hayrick. He saw a sliver of movement, a dark eye in a sliver of shadow. Tabani. She was there, watching, her face a mask of carved stone. He knew with absolute certainty that they had come for her. Jedediah appeared in the doorway of the house, his body framed by the dark interior. He held the rifle at a low ready, not aiming but making its presence known. The sight of his father, so resolute and so terrified, was more frightening than the riders themselves. The leader of the small party, a man with a hard, weathered face and a long scar that cut across one eyebrow, raised a hand, palm open. It was a sign of peace, but there was no peace in the air. The air was thick with history, with blood, with a chasm of misunderstanding too wide to cross. The leader called out, not in English. The words were guttural, powerful, a language that belonged to the wind and the rock of this land. It was a question, a demand. Elam did not understand the sounds, but he understood the meaning. "She is here. Give her to us." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the low moan of the wind, a lonely, desolate sound that seemed to be mourning what was about to happen. "Get off my land!" Jedediah's voice was a ragged shout, stretched thin by fear. He raised the rifle, the barrel now pointing squarely at the chest of the lead rider. "This is a warning. Ride out now." The warriors did not flinch. Their stillness was more unnerving than any threat. They had faced rifles before. The leader swung his leg over his horse and dropped to the ground, his moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He held his hands out to his sides, showing they were empty. He started walking forward, his steps slow and deliberate. Each footfall was a beat in a drum of escalating tension. He was closing the distance, forcing a confrontation. Inside Elam, a battle raged. His father's command to get in the house warred with a fierce, protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. To obey would be to abandon Tabani, to leave her to whatever fate awaited. In that moment, she was not Comanche, not a stranger. She was the woman he had nursed, the woman who had shown him the hidden language of the prairie. She was his secret, his responsibility. Just as his father's finger tightened on the trigger, a decision was made for him. Tabani stepped out. She emerged from the shadows behind the barn, moving not with the furtive caution of a fugitive, but with the deliberate grace of a queen. She was no longer the wounded creature he had found crumpled in the dirt. Her back was straight, her head held high. She had braided her hair, and she wore her pain and her fear like a mantle of dignity. She walked into the open space between the riders and the homestead, placing herself directly in the line of fire. Jedediah let out a choked sound of disbelief. The warrior's attention shifted entirely to her. The leader stopped, his hard eyes locking with hers. And then they spoke. Their conversation was a low, intense volley of Comanche words. Elam could not understand the language, but he could read the story in their tones, their gestures. He heard the leader's sharp, accusatory questions. He saw Tabani's responses, her head unbowed, her voice steady as she answered. She gestured once, a swift, sharp movement, towards the south, where the hunters had attacked. Then she pointed to her own leg, to the place where the wound was now a healing scar. The leader's gaze followed her gesture. He looked at her leg, then at the barn, then his eyes settled on Elam. It was a long, penetrating stare. It was not a look of hatred. It was something far more complex. It was a look of calculation, of assessment. He was piecing together the story without words. He saw the boy. He saw the woman who should be dead, but was alive. His eyes fell upon the coarse wool blanket she had clutched around her shoulders, the blanket Elam had given her. He saw it all. The anger in his face did not vanish, but it was joined by something else. A flicker of confusion, a grudging acknowledgement of a fact that did not fit his worldview. The scarred warrior held Elam's gaze for a long moment, the silence stretching taut as a bowstring. He was taking the measure of the boy, seeing past the pale skin and the strange clothes to the act that had been committed here. An act of incomprehensible kindness in a world that had taught him to expect only cruelty from this direction. The warrior broke eye contact first, turning back to Tabani. He spoke to her again, his voice lower this time, the sharp, accusatory edge gone. It was not a tone of forgiveness, but perhaps of understanding. She listened, then gave a single, solemn nod. The confrontation was over. The tension that had held them all in its grip did not snap, but slowly, carefully, began to uncoil. The warrior turned and walked back to his horse with the same deliberate pace he had used to approach. He swung himself into the saddle and looked down once more, not at Jedediah and his rifle, but directly at Elam. He raised his chin in a slow, deliberate nod. It was not a gesture of friendship. It was something more profound. It was an acknowledgement, a sign of respect for an act he could not have anticipated. It was a treaty signed across a vast cultural divide by nothing more than a shared gaze. Then, he and his men turned their horses. As they prepared to depart, Tabani walked over to Elam, her steps sure and steady. She stopped in front of him, so close he could see the intricate patterns of exhaustion and strength around her eyes. She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. Her touch was firm, grounding. "You are not a boy," she said, her English careful and precise, the words seeming to carry an immense weight. "You have a man's heart." The words settled deep inside him, a validation that eclipsed his father's years of stern instruction. She held his gaze for a second longer, a silent farewell passing between them. Then she turned, walked to the waiting warriors, and mounted the horse that one of them led forward for her. She did not look back. They rode away, not into a cinematic sunset, but back into the gray, indifferent prairie from which they had come. They were absorbed by the emptiness, their forms shrinking until they were nothing more than specks, and then they were gone. The sudden, profound silence they left behind was louder than the confrontation itself. Jedediah slowly, almost painfully, lowered the rifle. His face was a mask of bewilderment, relief, and a deep, unsettling confusion. The world had not behaved according to his rules, and the foundation of his certainty had been shaken to its core. Elam stood alone in the vast silence, his eyes fixed on the horizon long after they had vanished. The wind, which had been a harbinger of conflict, was now just the wind again, pulling at his collar, its ceaseless moan a lonely, neutral sound. He felt a hollowness inside him, the space that Tabani's secret presence had occupied. He turned and saw his father leaning against the doorframe, the rifle limp in his hand. Jedediah looked old, his certainty stripped away, leaving only a tired and confused man. Their eyes met, but no words were exchanged. There were no words for what had just passed between them, for the world that had been turned upside down in the space of 10 minutes. Elam walked not to the house, but to the barn. He went to the sheltered space by the hayrick, her space. It was empty. The air there seemed different, charged with the memory of her. On the ground, neatly folded, was the coarse wool blanket he had given her. She had left it behind. He knelt and picked it up. The wool was rough against his fingers. It was just an old horse blanket, but in his hands it felt like a sacred object. It was the proof. It was the treaty. It was the story of the last 2 weeks, a story of fear and trust, of pain and a shared humanity. He pressed the fabric to his face, breathing in the faint scent of wood smoke and wild herbs that clung to it. The entire brutal, beautiful, and terrifying complexity of the world seemed to be held within its simple weave. His father had taught him that the world was made of stark lines, us and them, tame and wild, safe and savage. But Tabani had shown him the truth. The world was not made of lines, but of circles, of connections, of stories that intertwined in ways you could never predict. He had not saved her. He had simply offered a small kindness, a cup of water, a threadbare blanket. And in doing so, he had received a gift far greater in return, a new way of seeing. He had learned that compassion was not a weakness, but a strength, a bridge across the most fearsome of divides. He stood up, holding the blanket, and looked out across the prairie. It was no longer just a vast, threatening emptiness. It was Tabani's world. It was the place she had survived, the place she had returned to. It held the herbs that could heal a burn, the tracks of the coyote, the history of people. He felt the fear that had been his constant companion for years begin to recede, replaced by something new. It was not the brash confidence of a boy who thinks he knows everything, but the quiet, resilient hope of a young man who has just learned he knows nothing at all. The prairie stretched out before him, immense and unknown, but for the first time, it did not feel like an enemy.